The night the argument erupted inside the White House began like any other polished marble floors, hushed hallways, and the soft glow of lamps bouncing off portraits of presidents long gone. But beneath the calm, something volatile simmered. It was the kind of tension no press briefing would ever capture, the kind that reshapes nations behind closed doors. People would later say they felt it in the air, as if the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for a spark. This story isn't about a policy dispute or a miscalculated strategy. It's about an insult, just a few sharp words, but words delivered in the wrong room, at the wrong moment, to the wrong person. And in a place where every phrase is weighed like precious metal, those words became a detonator. They threatened alliances, rattled global confidence, and pushed America's leadership to the brink of something darker. An entire country would feel the aftershocks long before understanding where they began. To grasp how one insult gained that much power, we have to step back, far from the microphones and ceremony, into the deeper history of how presidents, advisors, and diplomats navigate the one place where formality can dissolve into raw human conflict. Behind the public image of unity and resolve is an environment built on ego, pressure, and the constant calculation of who holds influence. Every decision is a gamble, every conversation, a negotiation, every disagreement, a potential fracture. For decades, the White House has witnessed arguments that would never be printed in official memos. Presidents have slammed doors, advisors have shouted themselves hoarse, cabinet members have walked out, furious. Yet most of these moments vanish into silence because the system depends on it. A nation's stability rests not just on laws, but on the illusion that its leaders rise above emotion, that they never lose their grip, that they never, ever let personal feelings sway national decisions. But illusions crack. The events leading up to the infamous insult began months earlier, during a period when America's reputation abroad was fragile. Allies questioned its commitment, rivals tested its patience, and within the White House itself, factions had formed. Some believed bold, aggressive action was the only way forward. Others warned that even a single misstep could ignite consequences too large to control. In the middle of that struggle stood a senior advisor known for being both brilliant and abrasive. He had a talent for cutting through polite nonsense, but also a record of offending nearly everyone at some point. The president valued him, not because he was easy to work with, but because he was unafraid to speak when others hesitated. Power grew around him like a storm cloud, dense and unpredictable. Opposite him was a statesman who had spent a lifetime cultivating relationships across the globe. Calm, measured, and widely respected, he believed the United States had already pushed too many boundaries. To him, championship of diplomacy was not weakness, it was the backbone of stability. He warned that the administration's internal tension was visible to other countries, that the world could sense division even when the official message claimed unity. These two men represented two visions of America's future, and they were headed for collision. The staff sensed it long before it happened. Meetings grew shorter, answers sharper. Aides whispered in hallways after briefings that left everyone feeling unsettled. Some said the president was losing patience. Others thought he was waiting for one of them to break. No one expected how quickly events would escalate, or how deeply the drama would pierce the nation's leadership. The breaking point arrived on a morning thick with humidity, the kind that makes the city feel heavier than usual. A crisis overseas had just worsened overnight, and the White House scrambled to respond. Intelligence came in waves, none of it reassuring. There were fears of retaliation, fears of economic fallout, fears that a single miscalculated statement could spark a chain reaction reaching far beyond American borders. Inside the Oval Office, tempers ran high. The statesman argued that the country must de-escalate before irreparable harm was done. The senior advisor countered that hesitation was a sign of weakness, one the world would exploit. Their voices overlapped, rose, and finally clashed in the open. Other officials exchanged uneasy glances, knowing they were witnessing something historic, something that could not end cleanly. And then it happened. A moment of silence, a breath held just a second too long, and the insult, quiet, sharp, and unmistakably personal. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of contempt, a message that cut deeper than any policy disagreement. The room froze. The statesman's face drained of color. The president's eyes hardened. No one moved. Those few words would leak within days, spreading across Washington like a rumor with teeth. Foreign governments learned of it soon after, though they softened the details to avoid being seen as intruding. But the damage was done. At that moment, America's leadership wasn't united. It wasn't steady. It wasn't even functional. And for the first time in years, an internal crack threatened to become a national crisis. What most people never learned was how long the pressure had been building, how the roots of that insult stretched back through years of mistrust, disagreements, and private resentments, and how the White House, despite its grandeur, can be a furnace, one that forges or destroys the people inside it. The world would soon watch the fallout unfold. But to understand the true stakes of that moment, to see how a single insult rattled everything from diplomatic cables to global markets, we need to step deeper into the story. In the hours after the insult was delivered, the White House shifted into a strange, uneasy quiet. Staff walked a little faster but spoke a little softer, avoiding eye contact, as if acknowledging what had happened might make it worse. No official statement would ever mention the confrontation. Yet everyone inside the building felt the ground tilting beneath them. Something had broken not loudly, but unmistakably, and it left a tremor that spread from office to office like a passing storm that refused to leave. For the statesman who had been insulted, the moment struck deeper than anyone realized. He had spent decades building bridges across continents, negotiating with leaders who saw conflict as a currency, and navigating crises where a single misinterpreted phrase could cost lives. He understood pressure. He understood tension. But what he had never imagined was hearing such a remark from someone standing only feet from the Resolute desk, someone representing the highest authority in the country he had devoted his life to serving. He walked out of the Oval Office with a rigid, quiet anger. Colleagues tried to catch his eye, but he brushed past them. For the first time, he looked like a man who wasn't sure if he still belonged inside those walls. And while he retreated, the senior advisor, sharp-tongued, unfiltered, confident, seemed momentarily shaken as well. Even he understood the significance of what he had said. In the White House, disagreements were expected. Sharp debates were part of the job. But a personal attack, especially one that cut into a man's character, crossed an unspoken line. It risked shattering the delicate balance that held the administration together. Still, he couldn't admit regret. Not yet. Power doesn't allow for immediate backtracking. Instead, he retreated to his office, shut the door, and let the weight of the moment settle in the quiet. It wasn't fear, he felt, but the cold recognition that forces much larger than him were now in motion. Meanwhile, the president faced a dilemma more complex than the public would ever know. He relied on both men, the steady diplomat and the fierce strategist, for different reasons. Losing either one would be a blow. Losing both could destabilize everything. And with a global crisis worsening by the minute, the last thing the country needed was a leadership implosion visible to the world. But the world already sensed it. That afternoon, foreign ambassadors began sending urgent cables back to their capitals. Details were vague, but the message was clear. Something had ruptured in the American command structure. Some allies grew nervous, worried that a divided government couldn't negotiate or respond decisively. Rivals, meanwhile, saw an opportunity. A weakened opponent, especially one hamstrung by internal conflict, is easier to challenge. In intelligence circles, analysts noticed small but telling changes. A foreign adversary postponed a scheduled negotiation. Another increased military activity in a disputed region. None of these moves were drastic on their own, but together they formed a pattern, like sharks circling a ship they sensed was taking on water. Inside the West Wing, the fracture widened. Rumors spread through staff corridors, whispers about resignations, about cabinet members taking sides, about the possibility that the insult would force a public reckoning. Some wondered whether the senior advisor had gone too far this time, whether he had finally pushed the president into choosing between loyalty and stability. Others believed the statesman would be the one to walk away, carrying with him the support of half the diplomatic corps. But the truth was more complicated. That evening, the statesman met with a handful of confidants. They gathered in a dimly lit office overlooking the south lawn, where the glow of city lights flickered beyond the trees. As he spoke, they heard frustration, disappointment, but also something heavier. He believed the nation was drifting toward a dangerous posture, one fueled by internal division rather than coherent strategy. And the insult, to him, wasn't just an attack on his character. It was a sign that the administration was becoming reckless. What he didn't admit, not even to them, was that he questioned whether he could effectively serve a president who allowed such behavior in the room where the most powerful decisions on earth were made. The senior advisor, meanwhile, gathered his own allies. They spoke in hushed tones in a conference room away from prying ears. Some supported him without question. Others warned that he had miscalculated. There was talk of damage control, though no one knew what form that should take. And beneath the debate was a growing fear. If this conflict became public, it could unravel the president's agenda and weaken the entire administration. For all their differences, both sides recognized something essential: they were no longer battling over policy. They were battling over the soul of American leadership. As tensions rose, interesting details began to surface, small pieces of the larger puzzle that most citizens never hear about. For example, the Secret Service keeps careful watch during moments of internal conflict, not because they expect violence, but because they monitor emotional volatility that could affect security decisions. After the confrontation, their internal notes flagged the West Wing as high tension, a quiet classification that rarely appears. It signaled a deeper concern. When leaders argue, especially in times of crisis, the risk of miscommunication skyrockets. Another detail came from diplomatic channels. One ambassador reported that his government requested a psychological profile update on the president's top advisors, a move typically reserved for moments of instability. They wanted to know if the insult represented a crack or a collapse. And then there were the historians. A few knew of similar incidents buried in presidential archives, moments where tempers nearly tore administrations apart. One historian later pointed out that the White House has always been haunted by a paradox. The nation expects its leaders to be flawless, but the building itself is a pressure chamber designed to expose every flaw. When tensions hit the right temperature, the results can be explosive. By the next morning, the crisis overseas had escalated again, and the president summoned both men to return. The meeting was unavoidable. The stakes had never been higher. They would have to sit across from each other once more, in the same room where everything had gone wrong. Aides waited outside the doors. Some stood in rigid silence, others fidgeted with nervous energy. They all understood that what happened in the next few minutes could determine not only the fate of the administration, but also the nation's standing on the world stage. Inside the Oval Office, the president looked at the two men who had served him, advised him, argued for him. But now, they represented something far more dangerous, a fracture that threatened to undermine the nation's influence at a moment when unity was critical. And as the door closed behind them, the world unknowingly held its breath. The door shut with a heavy thud, sealing the three men inside the Oval Office, as if the room itself had been waiting for this moment. Outside, the hum of hurried footsteps and ringing phones faded until only silence remained. Inside, the tension felt almost physical, like a storm coiled in the air, waiting for thunder. The president didn't speak at first. He paced slowly behind the resolute desk, hands clasped behind his back, eyes drifting between the two men who had once stood unified at his side. Now they strained to avoid each other's gaze. One carried a wounded dignity, the other a defiant unease. They looked like adversaries preparing for a battle neither wanted but both believed necessary. When the president finally turned to face them, his voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air with the precision of a blade. He asked them to tell him exactly what had happened the day before. No excuses, no filtered versions, just the truth. The statesman spoke first. His voice was calm, but beneath it flowed deep frustration, the kind that comes from years of being ignored at the moments when his experience mattered most. He described the disagreement, the rising tensions, and finally, the insult, the words that had pierced his patience and cracked the foundation of trust he thought they'd built. He didn't embellish, he didn't soften. He simply said what he heard, and how it undermined the mission they were supposed to share. Then the senior advisor stepped forward. His tone was more guarded, but something in him had shifted since the confrontation. Perhaps he realized how far he had pushed things. Perhaps he understood that pride had driven him beyond reason. He admitted he had spoken out of anger, that he had allowed pressure to eclipse respect, but he insisted he believed the statesman's approach would weaken the country at a moment when strength was essential. The president listened without interruption. He knew each man was telling the truth as he saw it, and he knew that truth alone wouldn't repair what had been broken. The insult was the spark, but the flame had been building for months, fed by competing philosophies and a swelling distrust that neither man had acknowledged until it erupted. At last, the president walked to the center of the room, and the weight of the moment fell on his shoulders. He reminded them that leadership isn't just about arguments won or strategies advanced. It's about trust, fragile, rare, and essential. He said America's influence in the world didn't rest solely on military strength or economic power, but on the belief that its leaders could stand together when history demanded it. Then he delivered the line that would resonate long after the room emptied. "If we fracture from within, the world fractures with us." Both men felt the truth of it, not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. Every crisis unfolding overseas had shifted in response to their division. Every ally waiting for a signal had hesitated. Every adversary had sharpened its focus. The world had sensed hesitation. One insult had echoed further than any of them intended. The president then made a choice that surprised them both. Instead of accepting an apology or demanding a resignation, he insisted they face the crisis together, as a unified front, not out of convenience, but because the moment required something larger than personal pride. He asked them to sit, side by side, and craft a strategy that combined their strengths rather than amplified their differences, and so they did. The conversation that followed was not warm. It was tense, deliberate, and occasionally sharp. But for the first time in months, their goals aligned. The statesman's caution balanced the advisor's forcefulness. The advisor's urgency sharpened the statesman's diplomacy. Slowly, a new plan emerged, one neither man could have built alone. Outside the Oval Office, staff waited anxiously. Hours passed. Some feared shouting would erupt again. Others suspected the silence meant disaster. But when the door finally opened, what stepped out was not reconciliation, exactly, but something sturdier. A working peace. News of the crisis abroad stabilized within a day. Allies regained confidence. Rival nations backed down. And within the White House, the atmosphere shifted ever so slightly. It wasn't cheerful, but it was steadier, like a bridge that had cracked, been reinforced, and now, remarkably, held. Still, the story didn't end in triumph. The insult remained in the memories of everyone who knew about it, a reminder of how close the country had come to internal collapse. Some staffers continued to whisper about what it meant for the future. Historians quietly noted it as one of the closest brushes with leadership fracture in modern times. And the world never forgot the moment when America appeared vulnerable, not because of an external enemy, but because of discord inside its own house. But something unexpected happened in the aftermath. The statesman and the advisor, though never destined to be friends, found a new respect for each other. They learned to read each other's expressions, anticipate each other's arguments, and even on rare occasions laugh at the absurdity of working in a place where every word carried the weight of nations. They never fully repaired what had been lost, but they discovered that even damaged trust can be functional when the stakes demand it. And the president, watching them from a distance, understood more clearly than ever the fragile nature of power. Leadership wasn't the authority to command. It was the responsibility to hold the center together when everything threatened to come apart. He knew the insult would hang over them like a faint shadow, a reminder of how quickly human emotion can endanger national stability. But he also knew that surviving it had made them stronger, if only by inches. In the end, the White House returned to its familiar rhythm: briefings, decisions, crises, late-night calls. But beneath that surface was a quiet lesson carved into the memory of everyone who had lived through the ordeal. Nations are not broken by rivals alone. Sometimes, the greatest danger comes from within, from the fragile nature of the humans entrusted with the immense burden of leadership. And somewhere inside those halls, in a room where portraits of past presidents watched silently from the walls, the echo of that near-catastrophic moment lingered, an eternal reminder that even a single, careless insult, spoken in the wrong place at the wrong time, can bring the world to the edge of unraveling.